Hi, everybody. Welcome to 1880. Welcome to the Double. My name is Marc Nicholson. I'm the founder of 1880. And I'm super excited about tonight. I'm super excited for a number of reasons. The first is that the last time I was here was 6 weeks ago, and everything upstairs was a massive construction site. And I thought, there's no way that we're going to make it by November 8th. But a half an hour ago, I went on a tour of the site, and it looks amazing. So if you haven't seen it, after this talk, we would love to show it to you. So if you're interested to see, there's 3 floors of restaurants and stuff upstairs, and we would love to show you. So we'll have a chat about the biggest issues happening in the world right now, and after that, if you want to decompress, you can go for a walk upstairs. So we'll figure that out after. Why else am I excited? I'm excited because I've wanted to have a chat with Parag for a long time. We've had several conversations. Parag is a very big supporter of 1880 in Singapore, and we've delved into previous books that he's done. We've done year-end summaries, but this is a very critical time, I think, in our history, and it's we're just very fortunate to have the opportunity to catch up with him. So we'll do that in a second. So I do want to let you all know that November 8th is the grand opening, so mark that down in your calendars and details will follow, but I think it's going to be the biggest party in Hong Kong this year. Yeah? Biggest party in Asia. Yeah. So that's fantastic. And I think that's about it. Let's get into it. Okay, you ready? Okay. So Parag Khanna is, I think, it always makes me laugh when I hear him introduce himself as a geographer, because it kind of reminds me of my grade 8 geography teacher, and you couldn't be more different from Mr. McLean. So as a lowly geographer who has probably the most perceptive analysis and wisdom on current events, and I think we throw it all under the title of geopolitics, but we're going to go through some of the biggest conflicts in the world. We're going to go through entrepreneurship and the drive behind economies, and we're going to go through AI and what that means for all of us. And if there's anything that we've left uncovered, feel free to ask questions. Give me, sort of 30, 40 minutes to kind of interrogate this guy, and then I'll hand it over to you, and you guys can ask a bunch of questions. Parag Khanna is the author of 7 phenomenal books. Most recently, Move, which I thought was a brilliant analysis. But the book that I am most fond of is The Future is Asia. And we can talk about whether he was right about that or wrong about that. How long ago did you write that book?
4 years ago.
4 years ago. Okay. So the future is now. We can get into that. But first, I want to start with kind of a sensitive topic that will hopefully open up a lot of discussion. So naturally, I'm talking about Taylor Swift and how Singapore monopolized Taylor Swift. 6 nights, we made a shit ton of money. Selling tickets to people from all over Hong Kong, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, because we decided that we didn't want her to go anywhere else in Asia. So if you wanted to see Taylor Swift, you had to come to Singapore. And so you talk a lot about the cooperation of ASEAN, but we don't always cooperate so well. And if I compare it to, let's say, Europe or North America ish, how would you define and how would you fix, or would you, Asia's relationship with itself? Let's start there.
That's a great place to start. But first, I want to start with big congratulations to you and the 1880 family. Marc is family. 1880 is home. This is a giant corporate mansion compared to the cozy home of 1880 in Singapore. But the beautiful thing is, with the partnership and flows between our two cities, you can avail yourselves of both environments and ambiance in either place. I, for one, could imagine making this my first port of call. So really, congratulations to you guys. It's amazing to be here. And for those who aren't members, needless to say, you need to sign up and get to have opportunities like this. And it is what people are looking for today, right? Is that place outside of the home where you feel at home. So thanks for providing that. Okay, so Taylor Swift is very, very controversial. I did score brownie points for daddy points for getting my daughter tickets for the opening night of the Taylor Swift series in Singapore. And it actually was a very useful economics lesson. If you're trying to get kids interested in everything from macroeconomics to industrial policy and subsidies and how do governments and countries compete with each other, just use Taylor Swift. You can explain things like the microeconomic multiplier effects, what share of GDP in Korea was elevated by, sales of certain albums, and the Taylor Swift effect in Spotify, and where are the revenues lodged? Is it the country of download and the Spotify subsidiary, or is it Sweden, and all of the kind of fuzzy accounting around that? In the case of that instance, which is obviously a segue into the ASEAN Greater Asian Cooperation Competition dynamic, well, Singapore made a brilliant cost-benefit analysis, right? And we were doing this back of the envelope at our dining table, and it was really fun. You pay Taylor Swift whatever 10 million extra bucks a night. How many flights? How many hotel rooms? How much F&B? How many tickets? And it was a massive profit, right? So that is how smart countries think, obviously, and Singapore foremost among them. So even when you are in a cooperative regional environment like ASEAN, or let's take the extreme case of Europe, right, which is, again, the paragon standard of supranationalism, which is to say the only region in the world where you have genuine institutions that are meant to be binding above the nation state level on the behavior of their members. Even there, you have intense competition, right? Switzerland is actually not a member of the EU, for obvious historical reasons, but the number one bilateral dispute between Germany and Switzerland is, of course, German billionaires bringing their money into Switzerland and obviously escaping the German tax net. And you've had, corporate tax competition, right, across countries too. Right now, ASEAN countries are obviously competing over foreign investment. Right, lots of multinational companies, industrial companies are pursuing their China plus one strategies. Where should they locate their next semiconductor plant, automobile parts, and so forth? And Vietnam is competing with Thailand, for example. Same thing obviously happens in Europe right now. Europe now wants to step up in semiconductors. So Germany and Italy and others are competing to get the American companies to do their fabs there and so forth. In America itself, which is literally one United States, Tennessee and Kentucky and Alabama compete tooth and nail, right, over investment. So just because you have this, nominal framework of diplomatic cooperation and attempts at harmonization of rules, you're always going to have competitive dynamics. And in Asia, in Southeast Asia in particular, and I think this is important whether you live in Hong Kong or whether you visit the various Southeast Asian countries a lot, there's something I want everyone to remember as not a fun fact, but an overarching truth. If Southeast Asia, the 700 million people-ish of ASEAN, if it were one country, right, you could say, it's roughly the size of the European Union anyway, and it's, a dozen countries, and so you could think of it as a country-like entity, right? It would be by, spread your arms as wide as you can, it would be by that much the most unequal country in the world. You have the absolute richest human beings on the planet Earth, right, Singaporeans, the resident citizens of Brunei and elsewhere, right? Artificially wealthy, like the citizens of Qatar, for example, but Qatar only has 250,000 people, right? And then you have obviously some of the poorest people in the entire world, right? In Myanmar and Laos and East Timor and elsewhere. Africa does not come even close in terms of inequality because Africa doesn't have nearly as many rich people, right? So when you think about just statistical inequality, ASEAN would take the prize. So how could you ever really have one harmonized system, right? Just think about all the startup companies that we want to support and finance, and you do it out of here in Hong Kong, we do it out of Singapore. We're supporting startup companies in everything from digital finance to biomass energy in Laos and Cambodia. They all need to be headquartered in Singapore in some way because people want rule of law and investor protection and all of those kinds of things. So the way I think of it is a division of labor. If you have the luxury, it's not a luxury, it's a hard-earned reality of at least peace and stability within a region and a group of countries that have fought wars with each other, obviously. If you do have peace, have a division of labor where one country, is really strong in commodities, another in, oil and gas, another has a, low-wage labor force, another has lots of industry, another has tons of farming, another is capital markets, right? Have that division of labor, and that's what ASEAN is actually moving towards. It will never be the European Union, but it'll have a healthy division of labor.
We talk about the pragmatism of Asia or ASEAN versus the, sort of the emotional responses of Europe and North America. If you look at, let's say Hong Kong versus Singapore competition, I have heard you say, and let's remember we're in Hong Kong, I've heard you say
Note to self.
Singapore is the capital of Asia.
So this is interesting. If we go back now almost 13-ish years, we were living in London, thinking about whether to move back to the US or to move to Asia. We obviously made the decision and sort of where to go.
We did the Taylor Swift with you as well?
Oh yeah, so it was like Dubai or Tokyo or Hong Kong, Singapore, and Singapore at the time, I remember, and this is a term I still use, but I first kind of coined it back then, so now it's over a decade ago. I said Singapore is the de facto capital of Asia. Now, of course, there is no Brussels or Luxembourg in Asia, but what country, what city de facto plays that role as the neutral convener and so on? It was not obvious, we're all old enough to think back 10, 15 years, it was not obvious that would be Singapore. It was obvious that it is Hong Kong first, Singapore second. My view at the time was that, and I guess, well, clearly we're not, this is not Chatham House rules, but to be neutral, you can't be too much anything. You can't be too Chinese or too Indian or too Australian or too Japanese. You have to be safely in the middle, geographically, culturally, diplomatically, financially, and so forth. So to my mind, using that definition of all of the functions of a capital, I said it's Singapore. And I didn't have a dog in the fight per se. I've done work with the Singapore government, not in an internal way, more like kind of consulting or whatever. But we voted with our feet. And now again, if you fast forward, again, I would love to hear any disagreement, but and we can talk through in detail what we mean when we say capital, but you get what I mean probably. And so I think again, Singapore plays a role. But more importantly, I've looked a lot at the role of cities, right, in the world economy, and that was a big part of one of my books, Connectography, was about what I call the global urban network civilization. That is what we are. And more cities is better, more urbanization is better, more connectivity among cities is better, more flights, more internet cables, more stock exchanges, more M&A, all of that stuff. And so this superficial notion that Singapore and Hong Kong must be rivals and a zero sum really defies most of the data. Yes, you can look at specific things. You can say, oh, but what about the 5 family offices that moved from there to here and or other direction? Fine. The macro picture is still one in which you create a whole greater than the sum of its parts by way of the flows between the nodes in a network. That's a mathematical rule. It's called Metcalfe's law. It's also, in a way, a rule that's playing out in the world of cities and their connections to each other. So, yeah, there's going to be, obviously, a tug of war over supply chains, over capital, over family offices, over investment dollars and flows, corporate relocations, yes. The bigger picture, so long as you have urbanization, population growth, economic growth, consumption, is that we'll be servicing each other to a slightly larger degree than we're going to be taking away from each other.
Okay, so this morning we all woke up to news of Hezbollah bombing Lebanon, Israel, sorry, and now we sit in anticipation of the response to that. We also had the rather boring VP debate this morning. We are October 2nd, so we're 5 days away from the 1-year anniversary of Israel-Hamas conflict. There's a lot of turmoil in the world, and I guess where do we want to start with conflict and resolution? And is 2025 going to be a year of reconciliation post-U.S. election?
I wouldn't put a date on resolution. When you want to talk about conflict resolution, you definitely start with the conflict, and you're lucky if you get to resolution. That's the way things seem to be playing out. I'm going to be in New York as of Sunday, and I worry that New York is going to be turned into, fill in the blank. But jokes aside, this is okay. First, the macro picture. What you've seen, whether it's Russia's invasion of Ukraine or Israel's invasion of Gaza, and now the war with Lebanon, and other conflicts that sporadically break out. You have strikes on Iran. You have Libya blowing up. You've got Armenia and Azerbaijan. You've got the Houthis attacking ships in the Red Sea. There's a lot of things happening at the same time. I want everyone to remember that none of these things individually or collectively are like sort of World War III. Here we are, and the world is moving on. The most important thing to remember is not to conflate any one specific episode or conflict with the notion that it destabilizes the world. It brings the world down. It is World War III.
Last night, I was having a chat with two gentlemen at 1880 Singapore, and they said it's 1942 all over again. And you got to ask Parag about this, because we have this, right-wing kickle fella from Austria, and that is going to be the tipping point. So I love the fact that you've just said that.
Everyone says that, but the truth is that, and again, there are deeper principles at work, which is that because we live in a world that's way more distributed, right? Latin America is its own center of power, North America, Europe, African subregions, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia. There isn't one node in the world, one central hub, whether it's one central power like the US or whether it is one conflict where you would say it's going to bring the world down with it. We have this ability to navigate around, bottlenecks. The Suez incident with the Houthi rebels is a good example because, yes, of course, there are ships that have been delayed and now they have to sail around Africa and that takes twice as long. But you also have new overland transit corridors with the Belt and Road Initiative, and you've generally found that there is resilience. There's this systemic resilience. Life goes on. The safest place to be is not to be a partisan, obviously, in one of those conflicts if you can avoid it, and to carry on your affairs. And the winners in any conflict are not the partisans. It's always the third parties. It's part of the reason Singapore is Singapore and Dubai is Dubai, right? If you are this stable island or oasis in the eye of the storm, all the money, the talent flows to you. And so more and more places are saying, I'm going to sit that one out, right, and see how I can maybe even benefit from the situation. So never conflate the particular with the universal is the first lesson. Whenever we put ourselves or put something else in the center of everything, just remember there is no center anymore. The world is not a monopoly. It's not a geopolitical monopoly. There isn't a single hegemon anymore. It's what I call the geopolitical marketplace, right, with many, many different actors and free association. So that's key. So when you look at a situation like Israel and Gaza or Russia and Ukraine, yes, there are ripple effects that are global. Commodities prices spiking. There have been conversations, very delicate ones, that you've hosted at 1880 with the Ukrainian ambassador, for example, who reminded everyone that every sixth loaf of bread in the world comes from Ukraine, right? Commodity price. Arab states get destabilized when wheat prices, imports go up because of the grain blockade and things like that. So yes, there are ripple effects around the world to these things. However, the best thing we can do is do our best to ensure that we keep our supply lanes open or diversify them in ways that keep us protected. So that, in some ways, might be one of the things that eventually helps to stabilize these places. If the foreign fuel on the fire dries up because outside parties may be less implicated and dependent on the outcome, then you have less resources to fight with. That's not what's happening right now, obviously. However, it's one of the scenarios. Otherwise, you don't get to resolution. Now, I don't think you asked about this per se, but and we can get into this, and I think every situation might be different, but if you have two outcomes, a frozen conflict in which a country like Ukraine is in suspended animation, borders aren't settled, it's not investment grade, no money is coming in for reconstruction because the conflict hasn't been settled. That, what's known as a frozen conflict, I've been to many of these frozen conflicts over the decades, and it's the worst outcome next to just war and death and destruction going on forever, because again, there isn't resolution. Without resolution and finality and the redrawing of borders and a sense of what the new equilibrium is, no one is going to invest in your country. So a lot of people would flip the script and say, no, the worst thing is to lose, because you're a victim, obviously, and you've been dismembered and you've lost territory and it's been a humiliation and so on, you've lost face. However, some kind of terminal resolution of a conflict is ultimately the healthiest outcome. And the proof we have of that historically is not only the European Union itself. You needed to have World War II end. There needed to be a loser in order to say, now we move on from this on terms that we have to accept, like it or not. The Balkan Wars more recently, right? The fragmentation of Yugoslavia, the collapse of Yugoslavia. Now, you wouldn't have the former Yugoslav republics effectively, they still have tensions, by the way, among them, but entering into a customs union and one by one becoming members of the EU gradually, right? If you didn't have an end to the war, with winners and losers. This is not to approve of what Israel is doing by any stretch of the imagination, or what Russia is doing by any stretch of the imagination. But having spent a lot of my life, studying border conflicts and even being deployed in war zones, I will say that as painful as it is, one side eventually has to win and the other has to lose, and that's a preferable outcome to a frozen conflict.
Agreed. There's probably a pretty big difference between these two conflicts in terms of their potential spillover and potential consequences of different outcomes. Do you worry more about the Middle East?
Well, I don't even call it the Middle East. I call it West Asia, to be clear. So it is for us as Asians in Asia. We should remember that, yes, it's technically geographically part of it. Remember the humble geographer here. Note to all your children, it's West Asia, not the Middle East. There's no such thing actually as the Middle East in modern, in sort of the modern. There's no useful modern usage of the term. It's a historical term. But anyway,
I'll be sure to tell Mr. McLean.
Yes, did you tell Mr. McLean? But well, first of all, it's sort of, when you talk about spillover, it's as if to say that the spillover hasn't already happened. It's always been a proxy war, right? It has been a war in which Iran and Syria and Iraq to some degree, and obviously Israel and Lebanon and Jordan are all directly or indirectly partisans and implicated in the results. So this is not, the spillover that is to come is only an amplification of all the spillover that has been.
So I was trying to get you to say one thing, which is Saudi Arabia.
Right.
So I'm interested
well,
in your
there's another
view
one.
on
So
that.
Saudi Arabia and Iran have been in other words, Sunni and Shia, Persians and Arabs have been at war in the region to some degree or the other, in internecine or active hostile way since the 1970s, right? You have to remember that the Iranian revolution, the Islamic revolution from 1979, was actually marked the beginning of the Iran-Iraq war as well. The Iran-Iraq war spanned the entire 1980s, right? And then Saddam invaded Kuwait in 1990, and that was Gulf War I. You've had Gulf War II. So to be clear, Saudi and Iraq and Iran have been literally, in the US was just sort of entered into accidentally and well, I mean, of its own accord, but stupidly stumbled into created a war in Iraq that it never needed to. But that war was already underway since 1979, right? So yes, of course, Saudi is involved. Saudi's involved in all the conflicts around the region, as is Turkey, by the way, to some degree, as is Qatar, as is the UAE. Hezbollah, the IRGC, you have the non-state actors and militias as well. This is not a place where the lines on the map tell you much of the story. One of the things, as I've been mapping out global infrastructure for a long time, there's pipelines connecting Saudi Arabia to Lebanon, that traverse territory that is older than the state of Syria and that will outlast the state of Syria. Right, there are infrastructures that literally are older than nations. I spent my childhood in the United Arab Emirates, in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and my brother is 5 years older than me. And so when he turned 50, I was like, hey, congratulations, you're older than the country you grew up in, right? Because he was actually born in Sudan, another post-colonial country that has seen better days, is the largest civil war in the world right now. So what we're seeing is this topic that's actually obsessed to me since I was a kid because of where I was brought up, which is the post-colonial world. And the post-colonial world is most of the world. It's most countries in the world. It's most citizens of the world. Most human beings alive today live in post-colonial countries. On the entire planet Earth, of the 200 countries, 150 are post-colonial countries, mostly carved out of the British and French empires. And my parents traveled around everywhere and lived everywhere and raised us in all of these various places, so they became my kind of turf. And remarkably, of all of those countries that are post-colonial, you can really only point to a single one, and you know where this is going. There's only one where you can say, tomorrow that country will still be there and it'll be fine, and it's Singapore, right? Which is kind of an exception, right, to the rule. You look at like East Africa, you look at the so-called Middle East, all post-colonial countries. And so what I've typologized kind of over the years is, what are the stages that a post-colonial country goes through in order to achieve fundamental stability, if it is to ever achieve it? In chapter 1, maybe just settling the borders and having domestic peace and having reconciliation among your different ethnic tribes that were divided or united by the straight lines on the map that shouldn't have been drawn the way they were drawn. Then, alleviating corruption and poverty and building your own independent institutions, having a form of government that fits with your culture rather than that which you inherited, and making peace with your neighbors and all these things. None of these things have happened in most of the regions of the world that are post-colonial. ASEAN is an amazing bright spot, right? Most of the troubles in ASEAN, of which we have many, whether it's Thailand, Myanmar, even Malaysia, it's primarily self-inflicted wounds now. A generation ago, you had the Vietnam War, you had Cambodia, you had literally, again, this was a hostile Cold War hotspot. Today, it's like, corruption in Malaysia and another coup in Thailand. It's like, it's like, relatively speaking, we're okay. And that's an Asian, you used the word pragmatism earlier, I'm glad you did. Asia is generally quite pragmatic. Going back to the macro geopolitical level, Asians have been able to keep the geoeconomic complementarity and even integration, think of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, moving forward despite all the geopolitical tensions. And that is the reality of the situation. You have a choice. You can succumb to geopolitical volatility and conflict, or you can pursue that pragmatic path, and that's what we're doing here.
So I love how you phrase that, because I just came back from North America. I was speaking to my 24-year-old nephew in Canada, who is just the laziest little shit that I've ever met, and it's the conversation evolves such that you understand the entitlement and the government owes me this. People owe me something, and that is so foreign. I've lived in Asia for 22 years now, and it's not part of the fabric here. It's get on with it, work hard, do your job, prosper. But nobody owes me anything, and no one's going to give me anything just for being born, right? And
I mean, if you think Canadian welfarist mentality is strong, imagine Western Europe. I mean,
well, exactly.
your nephew
exactly.
would be like,
And so I do worry about that, but it comes back to your whole thesis about Asia, the pragmatism. But what I want to get to is what forms the fabric that makes it strong? You talk about how different we are across Asia, but there are commonalities that ring true for, and that gives investors confidence, it gives economies confidence, it gives countries confidence.
Maybe the most culturally beautiful, and I do think it's beautiful, underlying trend in Asia of the last 30 years is actually what your very first question was, which is, how has Asia done it? Does it come together and integrate? This is also, not only did I talk about inequality or the most unequal region in the world, it is by far the most spectacularly dizzying region culturally. This incredible kaleidoscope of cultures, languages, ethnography, civilizational histories, 6 major civilizational groups and many other smaller ones right here packed into our East Asian realm. And yet, it has been exactly 33 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. And in only 33 years, these mutually unintelligible civilizations, including, of course, Chinese and Indian and Southeast Asian, many of them, have managed to trade. They now trade more with each other than with the entire rest of the world by a wide margin. So Asia first is a term that has had actually many different meanings over the past century and a half, owing to post-colonial movements. But the way I describe it, I call it Asia for Asians, is Asians, again, saying pragmatically, why don't we trade with each other instead of being dependent on European or American goods or technology, given the fact that we don't trust them politically and they are our former colonial masters and they just want to exploit us. And so despite this unbelievable diversity, right? Imagine like Koreans having to talk to Indonesians, having to talk to Indians, having to talk to Chinese, having to talk to Thais. Like, how do we do it? I mean, many of you may be part of those conversations, but think how hard it is just to do business. And the amazing thing about Asia that maybe we take for granted unless you're in those day-to-day negotiations with translators and different legal systems and codes, wow, the most diverse region of the planet Earth trades so much more, invests so much more. It's travel, it's trade, it's investment, it's tech. By every conceivable important measure, Asians are doing more with each other than they're doing with Americans or with Europeans. I mean, obviously there's a few significant exceptions like defense agreements and so on, right? But day-to-day life in Asia is Asian life. That's unbelievable to have done that. Remember that, because we're talking about just 30 years. If you go back 30 years, it's like, you know, India looks to Britain and Japan looks to America, and you still literally had post-colonial. And so here's the big point. 500 years of history, by which I mean the colonial history of several hundred years and the Cold War history of a half a century, have been gradually undone in just 30 years, right? And that's amazing. That is the biggest trend on Earth today, is the Asianization of Asia. And the rise of China, which everyone else would say is the biggest trend in the world, is the second biggest trend. It's part of the Asianization of Asia. The rise of China has accelerated the Asianization of Asia, but the latter drives the former. It's not the story in and of itself. And that is, I mean, we have to do everything we can to keep that momentum going, because God knows you don't want to be relying on the US right now. You mentioned the election. You don't want to be relying on Europe right now. You don't want to be relying on anyone right now. You don't even know where your next oil shipment is going to come from, given what's happening right now. You know, I saw someone, a very haughty, you know, kind of overconfident perhaps Israeli, posting today saying, "This is the port in Iran out of which 90% of their oil flows. Let's take a picture of it tomorrow, shall we?" Right? You know, so you don't want to be exposed to that, right? You want to be, and by the way, Asians have figured this out themselves. Asian financial crisis 27 years ago, the global financial crisis 15 years ago, COVID, these chapters over the last couple of decades that we've all lived through have taught Asians, you know, when the going gets tough, start to compensate by building bridges pragmatically with your neighbors. The reason we're here today is not by luck. It's because Asian countries from the bottom up, bilaterally, regionally, have learned from these very, very significant sequential crises that they've experienced.
Okay, can you speak a bit to the fabric, to the values, to the characteristics that make Asia more competitive than the rest of the world right now?
So competitiveness will come to, because maybe that's obvious. It's the hard work, the thrift, the self-reliance. Okay,
so let me, because I'm trying to push you in a direction to be more direct about it. You know, one of the things that I learned from my nephew is that he doesn't trust the system.
Yes. Okay.
He doesn't believe in his institutions. He doesn't trust his government.
Exactly.
Whereas here, you know, we remain afraid. Like, I think there's a balance of trust and fear of what can happen to us.
Yep.
There is, you know, the reason why I'm choosing to live the rest of my life in Asia is because filial piety is a thing,
Yep.
and I want my children to be guilted into taking care of me in my old age. And we don't do that in North America anymore. And all of these things, I think, are what put Asia
Yep.
far above.
No question. So this is what I call the new Asian values. For those of us who were following these debates in the 90s, there was pre-Asian financial crisis, so pre-97, 98. There was this sense that Asian values are ascendant because Asian economies are growing fast. You have Confucianism as the bedrock, you have filial piety, you have respect for law and order and authority, you have deference to authority, you have quasi-authoritarianism, yada, yada, yada. The problem was that after the Asian financial crisis, the global intellectual discourse considered that to have been exposed and bunk, right? Oh, look, it was just crony capitalism when you say Asian values. So then there was this period, this kind of like desert, intellectual desert, in terms of Asia defining for itself what makes it so successful, because again, the Asian financial crisis had been so crippling. So it took a long time for a set of values to be articulated that bridge that gap and that better describe how Asia is succeeding now, that does not rely, a corpus of principles that does not rely on Confucian culture per se, which is culturally specific. And so that's what I started to call the new Asian values. And there are exactly three pillars to it. The first is what I call technocratic governance, right? Even in democratic societies in Asia, we have a respect for authority. We believe the executive has a mandate to ideally...
Hey, for the non-geography majors, can you remind us what a technocracy is?
Oh, right. Well, that's a more political science concept. But
Poli-sci as well,
so
yeah.
it's basically the idea of leadership according to expertise and merit, right?
And
So
you're quite in favor of technocracy.
I'm ruthlessly in favor of technocracy. I'm not alone. It's sort of American political scientists have reluctantly gotten there by default, having seen just how chaotic and dysfunctional the system has become. I got there irrespective of what's happening because I believe that a technocratic system is perhaps the only one capable of managing complexity, right? You can't rely on democratic deliberation to fully understand how energy and environment relates to geopolitics, relates to demographics, relates to economics, and so forth. I do not expect the common man to be able to deliberate on those things. And so my point of departure is a complex, inscrutable world that is going to be very different tomorrow than yesterday and needs a committee of experts to sort it out at a national level or internationally, and that is what I would call technocracy. That's my modern usage of the term. So I'm in favor of technocracy, and Asians are too. And what you'll find, and this was one of the most fun parts of researching the Future is Asian book, was to say, if all Asians, by which I literally mean Israelis and Turks and Saudis, as well as Russians and Indonesians and Japanese, could agree on anything, what would it be? And it started as a thought experiment, but I actually came away very confident in these three principles. And the first is technocratic governance, which is that, again, we would go to Australia, where they up until very recently had literally a new government every 6 months, right? They were fed up too. They were like, you know what, wouldn't it be nice to have a government that had a mandate, that executed on its agenda and had a couple of years to actually do it, and we could measure their results, right? So again, we actually have a technocratic bias, which is to say, again, you could call it a deference to authority. You could say it's a belief in executive power, whatever, but the point is, leadership by experts with a mandate, democratically elected or not, give them time to get the job done, measure it, use KPIs and all that good stuff, have a strong civil service backing it. For me, that's a key principle of technocracy, is a civil service and a meritocratic set of institutions. But anyway, that's one. Number two, very quickly, state capitalism. Hardly a debate here whether or not we should be pursuing orthodox free market neoliberalism versus some degree of state intervention in the economy with subsidies or industrial policy. Obviously, that's daily life here in Asia, no debate whatsoever. The third is a bit trickier, but it's what I call cultural conservatism. Incremental liberalism would be another way of putting it, which is we don't just believe that you can shout fire in a crowded theater. We are okay with internet regulation and some degree of censorship or self-censorship. We're cautious about these things because we don't want to see destabilization. And this is the area where I initially thought 5 years ago, when that book came out, like, oh, I'm on wobbly ground here, I'm going to get attacked. And now, lo and behold, every day I wake up and yet another Western country is saying, we need to start regulating the internet. We can't just let people do this and that, right? And so this is one of my favorite arguments as to how the world is becoming more like Asia rather than Asia becoming like the world. So, which is not to say I support restrictions on freedom of speech, that I support censorship of the press. I do not. But if there are cases, and of course there are, where societies do that in Asia, there may be a legitimate reason for that, and we need to look at the specific context as to why. Okay. And I'm okay with having those conversations in the name of the overarching stability that we all hold dear in Asia.
Okay, so I'm going to give you guys a chance to ask some questions. We'll just cover this one territory. This has been a big year for you. It's a different year for you. You started a company.
Oh, yeah.
And I want to tell people why Parag started a company. His wife is a massive celebrity, intellectual celebrity in the AI space. And I think her star rose a lot higher than his did in the last couple of years. And I figured the reason he started his company is he started a company and he put AI on the end of it, and now his star is rising again to be almost level with Aisha's. Is that really what happened?
You can just stick AI on something. And in Singapore, I introduced myself as Aisha's husband because I'm a nobody. I can hide in the corner at 1880 and no one will notice me. So
tell us
AI,
about GeoAlpha.
I am not a digital native by any stretch of the imagination. I truly am a humble geographer. My passport is well worn. I still don't know how to make PowerPoint slides, let alone, but I'll tell you why I started the company and why AI is essential to it is because of the complexity thing. What I am is conversant in complex systems theory, right? And that's a macro sociological trend. It's what all my books are about. It's very firm ground for me. The relationship between geography and the complex crashing forces of economics and geopolitics and technology, that's where I'm comfortable. But to figure out what that means for the future of a country in a geographical way, you can't just rely on linear models. So AI is literally an essential methodology. It's not like just a shiny new toy or like a label you put on something to raise capital. You actually need it. Humans can't possibly model the complex trends that we as a company, AlphaGeo is the name of the company, what we do without AI. So it's a legitimate tool that we use. I would say that it can take you very far, but you obviously still need a gut feel. You still need intuition. You still have to have boots on the ground.
So this isn't a question about AI yet.
Right.
I just want to ask you about the business and what problem you're looking to solve.
Yeah.
And who your customers are.
So we started out trying to answer the following question. What is the most valuable asset in the world? What's the largest sector of the entire global economy? Some would say currency, some would say markets. Data. Could you put a value on it? Like today? No, I think it's a great answer. I'm just, so he said data. Well, pre-AI, pre-LLMs and data, pre-Sam Altman saying we need to spend $7 trillion on data centers in the AI stack, you would say land and real estate. Estimated total economic value, $350 trillion, which for those who aren't checking the latest World Bank statistics, is about triple the size of the GDP of the earth, right? So triple the GDP of all countries in the world is literally the stock of land and real estate assets aggregated up from the economies of the world. Now, because of climate change, because of geopolitics, look at the hurricanes that are hitting America right now. Asheville, North Carolina, for those who know the kind of cult hipster scene in America, I've got friends from college who were like, I'm moving to Asheville, it's the place to be. Okay, that town, it's very tragic, was wiped out by this hurricane, which, by the way, was a Gulf storm. Gulf of Mexico, North Carolina. Lesson in geography, they're not anywhere near each other. The remnants, and this is the term meteorologists use, the remnants of a Gulf Coast hurricane that hit Florida just wiped out a town in North Carolina. This is not the first time this has happened. So the price of an acre of land is actually the most stable data set that like any country has about itself. Some countries have had that data tracked, recorded in archives and file cabinets going back like 500 years. So we started with that. I love this story just because it's like, it's just so kind of, it's sweeping historical arc, you know, in a way. But yeah, the one thing, most countries don't know how many people they have, but everyone knows the price of an acre of land. So we said, what's the price of an acre of land tomorrow? Because it's the largest asset on earth, how come no one is asking what it's gonna be worth tomorrow? Because of climate, geopolitics, it could be bombed. Because of demographics, the world population is peaking and declining. China's population is declining, right? Most countries in the world have declining populations. Who's gonna buy those homes when there's no one left? When our world population is literally shrinking. So if you take geopolitics and demographics and climate and automation and industrial policy and all this stuff together, again, complex modeling, what will be the impact on the value of those real assets? And so that was our initial question, super challenging. And we started the company to answer that question, so our biggest customers became real estate and insurance and so on, and sovereign wealth funds and other asset managers, and it's just an adventure that I'm on.
For you, it was a sort of a, you raised VC funds, right? You went to Jungle, and I'm sure you went to a few before that.
No, only them, because the biggest VC fund in Southeast Asia is our lead investor, and I'm obviously enormously grateful for their risk taking, on the company, and that was new. I mean, if you're asking a personal question, management is not my forte, right? Sometimes I wake up and I want my old life back. I want to just, travel wherever I want, whenever I want, play tennis once a day, maybe more, hang out with my kids, not be on Zoom, management is not my favorite part of the job. But that said, if there's, it's been, since COVID, I've been able to learn by osmosis data science, something I did not know, climate science, something I did not know, how to run a company, something I did not know, and to get to do all those things simultaneously. And we're having an impact on actual asset managers and portfolios and insurers, and to me it's become a life's mission in a way.
Amazing. Okay, I want to give you all a chance to ask some questions. And I know you're going to start by being really shy. Someone's aggressive out there. Really? Do we have a roaming mic? Thank you. Wow, my wife does that to me too. She tells me what I want to do.
Parag, great talks. Happy to see you again. I want to ask you what your thoughts on Bangladesh, what happened in August 5th, if you have your own view, and would you see that happening across many other places in Asia? It is coined as a student-led revolution and the first successful one. We don't know obviously what will happen down the line, but what are your thoughts on it?
I think the operative part is we don't know what's going to happen down the line. I mean, this is not at all like the neighboring situation in Myanmar and what that was 10, 12 years ago. But for those who remember, and some of us, made a number of visits to Myanmar and were called upon either by the government or investors to go and promote the country and say, this is it, this is the new order, and Aung San Suu Kyi has been released from house arrest and has been nominally made, figurehead and, so on, and obviously that proved to not be the case. I wish for a better fate, of course, for Bangladesh, which obviously has, let's say, deeper democratic, origins and credentials. But if you do look at the last 10, 15, 20 years, right, there is obviously a pattern more of what we're familiar with in Asia, which is democratically elected, quasi-authoritarian kinds of one-party-ish systems, right? And that's pretty normal in Asia. So if that has genuinely been overturned or not remains to be overseen. You know, of course, I'm a fan of Professor Yunus, you know, as an intellectual, as a pioneer of microcredit and so forth, something I've written, you know, a fair bit about. But can he be a strong, you know, so it's not, can he be an inspirational, charismatic leader? We have a shortage of those, but he's a great one. But is there going to be institutionalization? Remember, I'm a technocrat. My ideal regime is a place like Switzerland where no one even knows who their president is because they have 7 of them at any given time and no one knows who's the rotating head, and it doesn't matter, and they can walk the street without a bodyguard. The most mature societies in the world, it just doesn't matter. The state runs itself, and it does so in a utilitarian way for the benefit of the people. It is responsive and adaptive and so on. Or you have a Singapore where, of course, people know who the leader is, but there is a state architecture, an apparatus, but the person's name is not Lee, and you know, and we had this, you know, a lot of people, you've been in Singapore long enough, and so have I, to remember when people used to obsess, or who can fill Lee Kuan Yew's shoes from the G4, the 4th generation, and it became a contest around personality. I was like, don't do this, guys, don't do this. The real evolution you want is to not have to fill anyone's shoes. And the problem with America right now is that going back to Obama, it was like, oh, we have a savior, right, after Bush's failed wars and so on and so on. It's like, you don't want this, right? You don't want to have this hero worship thing, because here we are now 18 years later, 16 years later, and we're like, uh-oh, who's going to be the next savior? If your country needs a savior, your country is screwed. Can I please tell you, as someone who's been to almost every country on earth, you know, and like, this is what I do, I study these countries, you're already doomed. So I just pray that Professor Yunus can radically empower state institutions, recruit the best and the brightest, pay civil service salaries well, build institutions, infrastructure, you know, have a team of people that's independent and committed to a decade of institution building and so on. That's the only way. Otherwise, I can write the script in my sleep where it doesn't end well. I've just seen it everywhere on the planet, everywhere.
Thank you. Yes?
Hi, I've got a question. Do you...
Can you just introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, sure. My name is
Not like a
Slavica.
long introduction, but
Sure.
a short one.
My name is Slavica. I am a sociologist by training, but I work in communications and crisis management as well. So, yeah, I've got a question. Do you envisage any sort of future in which nation states end or become obsolete?
Well, so
Probably not in our lifetime, but maybe like in some future.
You just asked a very, very good question.
So
Based on the discussion we had the other day, your triumvirate of you, Brian, and Balaji.
oh, right. So that might be the tail end of it, but so this is my favorite topic in the whole world, in a way. It's the red thread of all of my work is, again, political geography, right? Effectively, your question. So nation state, actually the term has a very specific definition in political science. It is literally based on the ethnographic composition of the population within the territorially defined borders, 85-90% of the people of the same group. There are exactly 11 nation states in the world today out of 200 countries. And Bangladesh is one of them, Japan is one, China is another. The rest are all very small countries where the vast majority of the population belongs to one ethnic group. So actually, other than those mostly Asian examples where everyone is of one ethnic stock, there aren't nation states. So your question is probably more on states themselves. We have more states than ever. We have 200 states. We had 50 when our parents were born. So clearly we have more states. We will always have more. We're going to have more and more states. If Russia fractures, if a whole bunch of countries are still set to fracture. It's my favorite parlor game is like, what are the next countries on the map? And I advised some of them. I was on the board of a NGO backed by George Soros called Independent Diplomat, who that's advised secessionist groups. Literally, this is my favorite thing to do. it's the risk board. So we will have more countries. We'll have more territorial states. So will we not have? Will we live in a world where there are not polities that control geography? Never. We'll always have more. But we will return to a world where cities matter more than countries, A. We're already in that world today. Most people just don't realize it. But there is no country, there's no functional, successful state that doesn't have a stable commercial capital, right? You could have the reverse. You can have a functional city in a collapsed country, but you don't have a country that is respectable that doesn't have functional cities. So we've always lived in a world where the cities are the drivers. We're returning to a world again where cities matter more than states, or a successful state depends on cities, A. That helps in some ways to transcend the idea that states are everything, because cities want one thing, which is to connect with other cities. Again, Singapore, Hong Kong, right? Hong Kong does not benefit if Singapore collapses, that's for sure. Everyone doesn't just flow back to Hong Kong. No. You benefit from the flows, and cities know that, they think that way. Mayors are the best diplomats in many ways for that reason. Fun fact, one of the things I started to do like 10, 15 years ago was to look at every mayor in the world, or I looked at elections in the world, and I felt that I could start to predict the winner by seeing if the mayor of the capital city was a candidate in the election. And I started just predicting like political elections, because mayors are always the most popular people. The mayor of the capital city is almost always the most popular politician in the country. And if that politician is going to run for president, very often they win. Very often, not always.
You're going to New York next week?
Well, I don't know who the mayor is of my hometown anymore. I don't know if he's going to survive another day. He doesn't deserve it, that's for sure.
But on a whole other level, with the advent of Bitcoin and the movement of capital, with decentralization, with people living very autonomously, like that's the network state.
So the principle underpinning that is the war for talent. Countries, no matter how much of a fortress they are, realize that with a finite or even declining world population, it is better to have people than not to have people. Of course, you want the right people, which is why Canada is freezing immigration, not freezing, it's reducing immigration, heated debate in the US and Europe and elsewhere. But the war for talent is the operative demographic principle in the world today. As part of that, a state that wants to attract talent is going to have to change its regulations to be attractive. It's going to have to be politically stable. It's going to have to be culturally liberal. It's going to have to be welcoming to cryptocurrency and flows of capital and all of those kinds of networks that individuals participate in that make a place attractive. So we're going to see these transnational forces that harmonize standards operating across networks of states that collaborate with each other. And this was something we were talking about a lot last week. It's one of my favorite topics is what I call the new Hanseatic League. The Hanseatic League was this collection of city-states in Northern Europe that was an armed trading federation. I went to high school in one of them, Hamburg in Germany. And the world is becoming this collection of like allied city-states. Hong Kong could consider itself one of them, right? Hong Kong meets Singapore, meets Estonia, meets Dubai, meets London, meets Edinburgh, meets Toronto, meets San Francisco. It's those axes of cooperation where they say, okay, if you fly between these two airports, visa on arrival or pre-clearance or, talent visas between those cities and countries, that kind of stuff, startup hubs and incubators, stock exchanges linked. That's not like some pipe dream. That's like the last 10 years. It's been happening all the time, right? That's where the world is going. It doesn't eliminate territorial sovereignty. Sovereignty is literally the single most important word in understanding the physical organization of the world today. The second most important word is connectivity. I think connectivity is starting to trump sovereignty in some places, but not all.
Good question.
Great question.
Yes, sir.
My name's Rashid Shroff. I was born and raised here in Hong Kong. I run a couple of businesses in the region, in Taiwan, Vietnam, and here in Hong Kong. I'm very optimistic about Asia. I think Asia has a lot of momentum. You gave us a lot of reasons why we should be optimistic about Asia. And thinking about Asia, but particularly Southeast Asia, I'm wondering, what are the challenges you see for the region in the next sort of decade or so? Because we've all been very optimistic in this discussion about Asia as it relates to the world and what's happening here.
And unique challenges, huh?
Yeah. So I'll go quickly, but the first is what I said earlier. There are these political own goals, right, in each country. Again, it's not outside intervention. ASEAN is not being invaded in the conventional sense, and therefore, again, it's self-inflicted wounds is one. Another that doesn't get talked about enough is climate. And this is critical for all of Asia. The rise of Asia, the industrialization of Asia, Asia playing a leading role now in the worst category, which is greenhouse gas emissions, is accelerating the sinking of Asia. This is one of my glib punchlines, right? The rise of Asia is accelerating the sinking of Asia. What region of the world has more people living in coastal megacities exposed to sea level rise? Right? We do. Do we have a common, coherent climate strategy in Asia? No, of course not. Do we have clean tech leaders in hydrogen, nuclear, and so forth? Yes. Solar. Could we transfer those technologies around the region? Yes. Could we subsidize them more and fortify ourselves against climate shocks? Yes. Are we doing that? No. There's no RCEP for climate, right? So for me, one big gaping kind of hole and opportunity for Asian diplomacy is very aggressive climate adaptation measures that benefit all of us because we're so deeply economically integrated. Let's remember the China-ASEAN, the RCEP relationship is basically now the world's largest economic trade bloc or zone, right? So we need to do that. So I'd highlight the domestic politics, I'd highlight climate, obviously geopolitics, but that's episodic, right? It's like it can happen or maybe it won't, right? And so it's sort of, it's a stochastic thing. I worry about South China Sea, I worry about Taiwan, I worry about each of them, but I do not put those at the center and say that, well, everything is frozen in time until those are resolved, because again, that's not true, right? And that was my point earlier about pragmatic, geoeconomic convergence despite the geopolitical hostilities. And I'm not gonna flesh it out here, not in this country, but like what I said earlier again, all wars end, right? One way or the other. And when they do, let's remember that history goes on, and otherwise you wouldn't have the European Union, right? So one way or the other, whatever the conflicts are anywhere in this region, they will end. There will be a winner, there'll be a loser, right? And then there will be connectivity and not necessarily integration, but there will be resolution and interdependence among the states and territories that follow. That is literally what always happens with zero exceptions. So again, we may not like the outcome to each and every conflict, whatever path it may choose. I myself have stuck my neck out and published, my views on how specific conflicts like the South China Sea should be resolved. They've been in the South China Morning Post, they've been in the Straits Times. I've gotten a lot of flack for them, but again, I've studied this from all angles, and I prefer resolution to suspended animation.
Are there more questions? Yes, sir. Thanks, Dave.
Hi, I'm Rohit. Work with the bank. More on the sidelines, something that's kind of I'm observing through news and over the years. We always had, from a trade bloc perspective, we've always had the NATO, we've had the European Union, and over the years, I mean, when I was growing up, we had SARC, if you remember, the South Asia regional cooperation, and that kind of died down. Then we had other blocs coming in. You had, the Silk Route, then you had the Trans-Pacific Treaty, you now have BRICS. All of these different sort of trade blocs coming, some of them come in, they make a bit of noise, and then suddenly they die down, and then you see them again. Do you see like this sort of polarization of countries coming together? Yeah. So question one is, do you see any of these blocs becoming more pertinent over the next few years, or do you see more such blocs coming in?
It's a great question. So earlier when I was talking about RCEP, I described it as a zone. I didn't use the word block, but I should consciously explain why. We don't have blocks anymore. We have sponges, is the term I prefer to use. And if you look at the behavior, the negotiating strategy, the behavior, the trade policies of Southeast Asian countries, what you'll notice is that they're pro-RCEP. They're also pro-TPP. They're pro-FTAs with the EU. they're pro-trade with India. They're pro-everything. And that's called open regionalism. That's the formal academic term. Open regionalism is what smart countries do when they don't get to write the rules, but they benefit from playing all sides. And if I have a Venn diagram PowerPoint slide that I love to show, and it shows countries that are members of TPP, which is now known as CPTPP, RCEP, and other groups. And what you find is right in the middle of this Venn diagram, the countries that sign up for every possible trade agreement, no matter what, even if it's on the other side of the planet, it's ASEAN countries, are practicing this opportunistic open regionalism. And there's a great expression for this, a great quote, idiom kind of by Tommy Koh, former Singaporean, legendary Singaporean foreign minister, who said, "We would sign a free trade agreement with the moon if we could," right? And that's like the best line ever. It is so true. And the smartest countries in the world practice this multi-alignment. Again, you don't get to make the rules. Just be friends with everyone. Multi-alignment is a fancy way of saying be friends with everyone. Figure out what's in it for you. How do you get the best deal for yourself? And that's what ASEAN countries are doing. So will we see more? So now, someone else had asked me earlier if we would talk about BRICS. There's a BRICS summit or a Shanghai Cooperation Summit or this summit, that summit, acronym soup every week. I love it. I love it. Why? Because it's countries escaping from, what did I say before, 500 years of colonialism where they don't get to dictate, they don't get to make decisions for themselves. 50 years of Cold War where they're pawns. And only since 1991 have we lived in a world where you even had the hope, the potential, the wish, the dream, the right to make decisions for yourself, right? As a second-tier country in our lifetimes, right? Sovereignty, modern sovereignty as we know it, has formally existed in a legal sense since the year 1648, Treaty of Westphalia. But you had centuries of colonialism and imperialism and Cold War after that. Only 1991 is the first time where you can say it's an open world. It's a free world. Do whatever you want if you can get away with it, right? And so it's in that world where every country is saying, you know what, BRICS, sign me up. RCEP, sign me up. TPP, sign me up. FTA with Europe, sign me up. Shanghai Cooperation, sign me up. Whatever, right? That's awesome. And I'll tell you why. Because in this marketplace of concepts, ideas, institutions, alliances, no one uses the word alliance in Asia because we don't actually believe in them. We'd rather just, why lock yourself into one relationship when you can be polyamorous diplomatically, right?
That's the difference. That
right?
is exactly the difference.
And that's beautiful. And I'll tell you why. It's not because I want to see a lawless world. Not at all. It's a world in which, in this marketplace, you have to prove that your product is superior. Your bloc, your alliance, your trade grouping, your institution, your rules, your products are better. Otherwise, I'll just go somewhere else. I can pick from 10 countries to launch my satellite, build my internet cables, provide me vaccines and medical equipment, or finance my trade, right? That's beautiful. It means that little Indonesia, well, big Indonesia, or Vietnam, or the Philippines, get to say, no, you don't get to build my high-speed rail. I'm going to go with you. You don't get to build my power plants. I'm going to go with you. I'm not going to accept your terms for this loan. I'm going to go with those terms. It's a race to the top. If I'm America, if I'm China, if I'm Europe, I've got to offer you good terms, right? I've got to be in your corner. I've got to give you a good deal, right? That's not the way small countries, that's not the circumstances they had to deal with for the last 500 years. So yeah, for most countries, most of the time, and most places in the world, if they can get their shit together, to put it in a much more colloquial way, it's an amazing world of opportunity. So the question is, can they get their shit together? That remains to be seen, and that's where it's every country for itself.
Okay, let me see. Are any pressing questions out there? You're all okay? Okay, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to try to do this 2 questions in one. You have a sort of a theoretical question that you'd like to pose, which is where are people going to live in 2050?
Well, it's not theoretical at all.
Well, it's not theoretical, sorry, but you have so I'm going to ask it to you in a different way, which, since agrarian times, maybe there have been 40 generations of humans living together.
That's right.
It's not a lot, 40 grandmothers.
Yeah.
It's not a big room. But what I like to ask people is, how many more generations do you think humans are going to occupy this planet? And there's, what's interesting, I do this at dinner parties a lot, and with young people, what I've noticed is that 20-year-olds will answer me another 100 or 200 generations. It's very optimistic. 30-year-olds will say to me, 2 more generations. Like, we're dead, like, soon. Like, this is the end game. And I'm like, then what are you doing here, if that's your view? And old people, like us, generally interrogate the question, so that they won't give me an answer, which is what Parag's about to do. How many more generations do you think we're going to last on the planet?
So, I mean, humans will be around for a long time, but there'll be fewer and fewer humans, no matter how many kids Elon Musk has.
Pause right there.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is something that really bothers me. We say that you mentioned it earlier, that we have declining populations in most of the world, except maybe Africa, correct?
Yeah.
And everybody says that's a bad thing because we can't figure out how we're going to pay for the homes.
Right.
We can't figure out how we're going to pay for medical care, and et cetera, et cetera. When I ask young people if this is a bad thing, they'll say no. The most environmentally damaging thing that you can do is produce a child.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. This was, yeah.
So, what is the ideal population?
I
for
cited
world?
this statistic in my move book because it was fundamentally the point of departure was this population decline, and therefore the need to compete for young people. Because if our kids aren't having kids, then our kids are the last major generation. But to power your economy, you need kids, either the kids of today or their kids of tomorrow.
Well, that's why Trump is doing the anti-abortion thing.
Well, I think he's pandering to whoever will pay him. But again, no matter how many kids Elon Musk has, no country in the world has successfully turned around the declining fertility rate. And kids today, whether it's because of the economic crunch or because of their climate consciousness and everything in between, are not having kids. So our children are not having children. At most, they will have 1 child, literally. That's it. So the world population is going to go off a cliff. It's peaking in the next 10 years. It's already peaked in Japan and China. Everywhere. There's only a few countries in the world that don't matter to you where it hasn't peaked, right? Like in Africa. But they're not coming here, so they're not helping you. So effectively, the world population has peaked and is declining. So what's the optimal number, irrespective of how many generations it takes to get there? Well, again, you may have another pandemic, you have climate catastrophes, you have World War III, all these things like happening at the same time. So you could, there's a steep way to get to the number or a gradual way to get to the number. The number is probably, the best case scenario is between 5 and 6 billion. And you get there without killing people. It's just because if you think about the baby boomers and the pioneer generation and so forth, the greatest generation and the baby boomers are the successive generations that were born in the Depression and World War II. They will naturally pass on, literally in the next 15, 20 years. And as they do, that's a couple of billion people right there, right? So, and then if you have that, and then you have natural attrition, you have, again, children not having children, you get to roughly, let's say, 5 to 6 billion over the next 30, 40 years, basically. We can handle, one of the things, again, the geographer talking, the planet Earth has a terrestrial surface of all the continents. It is 150 million square kilometers. 8 billion people today can fit in Singapore standing side by side, right? 6 billion people need even less space. There's plenty of room on the planet Earth for all of us. Where we will be will determine which places are worth being. So one of the things I noticed today is that when we talk about digital nomads and network states and this kind of thing, it's like I look at the cities where young people want to go because young people who have kids want to be in the cities where other people have kids. But there's very few cities in the world where any kid has kids or any millennial is having kids. And so this is the East Berlinification, like, of some places in the world. And you ask, like, you know, because the answer I always give to where will you live in 2050 is Berlin, because I've lived there so many times. It's kind of like my home away from home. And I'm happy to watch the end of the world from, like, my rooftop of my terrace in my apartment in East Berlin. And you're all invited for the party. But there are very few places. The further you look in the future, so this digital nomad thing and this golden visa thing that some people treat as a fringe trend, it is not. I have very real world material experience with this because I wrote this book, Move, and it was supposed to come out during COVID, and my publisher called me up. Literally, he's like, dude, you just wrote the dumbest book in human history. You wrote a book about mass migrations of human beings, and it's 2020, and we have the biggest lockdown in world history. Nobody is moving. Like, oh my God, we're so screwed. And I was like, hang on, have patience, stick to your guns. Lo and behold, by the end of 2022, within 2 years of COVID beginning, world migration and travel reached record levels, right? So and instead of 5 countries having digital nomad programs and whatever golden visa programs, 120 countries have those programs. So this is not a sideshow, right? It is the future. It's young people moving, and as young people vote with their feet, they determine which places will win and lose. And so the map of 2050 at the end of the day is just going to be, over the next 5, 10, 15 years, whichever places, cities more than countries, whichever cities young people feel is the right place for them to hang out and call home in their childless or one-child households. And right now it's Lisbon, and it's Athens, and it's Dubai, and it's Montreal, and it's Singapore, and Berlin, and a bit of Helsinki. And you factor in, though, geopolitics and climate, people will zigzag and move around. But you can kind of every 5 years pretty much know where the action is.
Okay. It's a great note to end on. I want to thank you all for coming tonight and for your patience and for your questions and your attention. Like I said, if you would like to see the space, we'd love to show it to you. So maybe we'll form a gathering in the front. And Nadia, everybody wait, there's Nadia. We'll organize some tours. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Parag for being here tonight and for sharing his thoughts with us. I love it. Okay, thanks. Have fun. Ciao.